Hey, I, hey, I, DIY, 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 DIY.
Yeah, I think it's been a pleasure getting to do this with you guys. Honestly, I'm just like thrilled about what 2024 has like shaped up to be and all of our prospects for next year. Uh, you know, like Keith mentioned, kind of, us starting in architecture, I think we learned a lot about how to think in hierarchies, taxonomies, the sort of like discrete parts and pieces of buildings, systems like HVAC, water, structures, and more. And so after college, deciding not to be an architect and wanting to get into technology, early on, even with you doing, design work, so much of what we learned around like Illustrator, Photoshop, and the whole Adobe Creative Suite just naturally transitioned to like UX design skill sets. We could draw, we could think, could put these kind of designs together, help people think through whole flows all the way down to discrete details that they needed to solve. And so technology always just like felt natural, and UX design was like a logical next step. And now, I mean, fast forward from past 7, 8 years to today with like AI, mean, I'm blown away by how increasingly like technical I'm able to be involved and like sort of understand what the technology is doing. And that's just been super exciting with various like AI assisted developer tools that I'm sure we'll talk about. So I'll let Chris chime in.
Pass it to Chris. Yeah, Chris, if you could tell us a little bit more about yourself. I know that you're like junior developer on this. I mean that as like you're new to the you're starting a developer career very recently, and you've done a lot in the past, and I'd love to kind of hear how that experience has been. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, so I'm the newest guy in the office. I think I've been around for 7 months with you guys about so far, and I just moved up here to Colorado to live here for good. So I've really leaned into the AI projects we're doing, and I've had a lot of fun so far. We've done an incredible range of work in AI. I'm coming from a design background as well. What's on my mind is that since Eli's sitting next to me, like he's been killing it in Figma. And one of the things we did recently with the AI developer assistant tools is like use this tool called Anima, or that's what I was using. And I took one of his mockups and like directly put it into Anima, which generated React code for us. And like, I guess you guys weren't around to see the process of that, but it was really cool that like we have these kind of tools that we specialize in, that we kind of know the full array of tools we have. And it's just enabled us to go to mockup from mockup to code like super fast and have code that works. And then this Anima tool is might get replaced by Figma AI soon, but both of the tools have an AI chat built in where like if the code's not perfect, it can help you get there. And I just think that's crazy that the synthesis of both Eli and mine design and just knowing how to code it really quickly. And I've just, as far as I go, I've been learning like at a rocket ship pace with these guys in the office. I don't think I'd get to have this opportunity to learn AI in other places. So I'm really having a good time here and enjoying like looking at really complex strategies and stuff.
Well, definitely, yeah. Fascinating. I think that I want to start with like a first question, which is that a phrase that I use a lot is magic moment. So like, what's this like? A lot of times people with technology have a magic moment, which is often defined as like when they realized exactly what this thing is trying to do or really understood the intent of the creators. And so I think that's something that like I wanted to ask you guys was like we've all been playing at some level of the product development process from initial customer interviews all the way to deployed code of a web or a mobile app. We've all played at different stages of that in our career. And so I think my question to you guys that I'd love to hear is like, when did you first experience AI in that process? Was it ChatGPT in November of 2022? Was it in the Figma AI product? Like, where did you first encounter AI? And I don't mean just like you saw it. I mean like you used it and you said, "Dang, I couldn't have done that before." I'd love to kind of hear if you guys have stories like that or kind of where you first perceived it in the workflows that you were already doing.
Yeah, sure. So like my first kind of jump over into coding from architecture was a boot camp called Hack Reactor that was a couple years ago now. And like ChatGPT wasn't really established at that point. And I remember it just being so hard to do these like chess problems, these like the toy problems where you have to solve matrices and stuff because we had to solve them ourselves. And that's kind of like my gut reaction was stronger when ChatGPT came out because I was like, oh my God, this just solves it. And it's like, wow, if I would have had, I'm thankful that it wasn't out because I had to learn code the hard way. But like, if I would have had that, just all the, you know, interview questions we had to go through and study for days for would have just been like so much easier to execute and to learn. And I think like there's something to be said for knowing what the code's doing, but like I was just amazed by how helpful it is knowing how hard it was without it.
Yeah, Chris, I'm just gonna ask follow-up questions. We're really here trying to
Yeah.
casual. Like when you were doing all those different types of problems, right? And you're like trying to solve these matrices and stuff. Do you feel like when you actually use AI and it does those types of things for you, that you're losing anything in that process? Do you feel like you gained anything by kind of doing it the old way before that stuff came out?
I do kind of think that I gained something by doing it the old way, and I know that coming to the office, we use AI tools almost exclusively, and I was initially resistant to it because I really like to read through every line of the code, know what it's doing, but now I'm like, I think it's really just more helpful, and I just almost learn more and definitely learn faster having a little bit of grounded in knowing what the code's doing, but then just like it teaches me along the way. And it's like I've had some better conversations than I've had with humans with it, just talking to it and asking follow-up questions to the GPT itself.
Right? It's not.
Yeah.
I think it has a weird sense.
It does, yeah.
I want to say like too, like, did you like you had initial hesitancy?
Yeah.
What do you think? Like, was there a moment or an application or like over time where you started to think of it a little less negatively?
Yeah,
You still think of it that way sometimes.
I think like initially on the insurance project we were working on, I ran into a wall where I kind of doubted like we were leaning into it so hard. And then I was worried that we wouldn't know where it's taking us and we'd hit a wall where it like wrote hundreds of lines for us that we didn't know what they were doing and then we get stuck and how do we go back and rewrite this? But then like I discovered that it was just like I didn't know the full way to use the tools yet and all the different modes Cursor has and like the interpreter mode and like the different it almost also just prompting it that if you can prompt really well, like you can almost get it through any problem. And so that hesitancy has gone away through probably just like learning how to talk to it better.
Yeah, I want to like build on that because I've had similar feelings, as exploring even things like, the new versions of React and how components change. Thinking about like exploring with AI, letting it teach me concepts, letting me interrogate it. I'm really trying to get away from calling like investigating with AI because you're interrogating this like bot to like these things, right? But the way I've been thinking about it in my head that I haven't really found a great way to express yet is just that like it takes the act of composing software like away from what people think of as like a kit of parts, like building like a super complex Lego set, to when you're in this like discourse with these agents or using like AI assistants in creating software, design, whatever you're trying to make. It's so much closer to sculpting and so much closer to like pottery. Like if you've ever tried to like throw clay, and you sort of work something. And once you hit the context window limit, sometimes your pot falls apart and you're kind of left this artifact that isn't quite like what you were expecting. Yeah. And so there's this act, even if it's happening mentally, right? I'm not even saying like literally in the code, but like you kind of crumple up that clay again, throw it, reset your context, give it another rip, and then you have a beautiful, pot that you've created. Yeah. And I think that that's a very difficult transition for people to make from, say, like what I would traditionally call like craftsmanship and the kind of kit of parts building metaphor I think we're much closer to like a space where we're artisanal about software. It's sculpted, it's shaped, it's formed, and it like can change over time. Historically, I even think like 18, 24 months ago, working in like enterprises, that would not resonate, right? Because everything has to be discrete, expectable, have like very clear criteria and relationships. And now with AI, you can rewrite entire patterns in fractions of seconds. And so it's different, these days.
And like to build on that metaphor, it's like sometimes when you're sculpting with clay, like you'll add a big clump if you wanna get somewhere else, and then start sculpting again. And that's kind of one of the things I see Keith do a lot. Is like I'll see him just asking ChatGPT where to go next, or like even asking ChatGPT to how to like prompt itself. And so I've been trying to use that as example to do it myself too, because I really that was like a huge lesson for me. I was like, what? You're asking ChatGPT how to ask ChatGPT?
But it goes back to Louis Kahn
Yeah.
and his writing as a famous architect,
Yeah.
where he has this story.
Oh yeah.
So
Sometimes these two guys drop art.
but this one is particularly apt to this reference because Louis Kahn was always like really well regarded and highly celebrated for the material choices that he made.
Yeah.
The Kimball Museum in Fort Worth, right? Very famous globally recognized art museum for natural light, materiality, and the choices that were made. And he has a very, very famous quote where he goes and he says to go ask your bricks what kind of brick they want to be. And that's huge in this day. Like having agents that are sort of reasoning and helping us make patterns and helping us shape these softwares, that like intuitive nature of Keith to ask, the agent, what does it think it wants to do? Is a similar approach to somebody who is more of an artisan, somebody, like a very, very well-respected kind of like point of view about how to make building choices, like asking your materials what they want to be and interrogating that, pursuing that line of questioning will shape the way that you approach building something dramatically differently than if you were to only ask the humans what kind of building they want.
Yeah.
Right? And so his point is like, sort of digging deeper into like the raw materials of what you're working with. And like the raw material of an AI collaborator is just so new that I think we're still trying to like figure that out. But it's a good insight. And I think it's a compliment to the way you approach your work.
Yeah, I guess for how I've talked to AI recently, I've noticed just the ways on how to talk to it is you really have to kind of provoke it. And there's it doesn't like when you speak to it negatively. It doesn't like all sorts of things. But I want to start with like a kind of like an embarrassing failure story that when I just started out talking to the AI that made me realize all this was before I worked here or I started working here, I was like looking for jobs and I was contacted by this like one of the biggest Rust YouTubers, and the job was to like be his content editor, like make all the content for his videos because he didn't want to do that. And so I got through all the rounds to the final round. There's like a few people still he was looking at, and the final task was to like make a mock draft of like a YouTube video on Rust, like an interesting topic that is new and relevant to Rust that's not out yet. And so he had like this kind of outline that I had to follow and fill in with content. And my plan was, oh, well, I'm just going to do all this with ChatGPT and I'm going to prompt it on how to, based on this topic, I think it was like a Docker alternative built in Rust or something.
That's so Rust, by the way.
Yeah. So it's like, I'm going to talk about how new and how much blazingly fast this is and stuff. I guess the story is that I kind of like spent so much time talking to my duck and trying to get ChatGPT to just do it all itself and trying to craft the perfect prompt to output the 600 required words for this essay that's going to turn into a YouTube video that I probably wrote the essay about 13 times over, and I just never submitted it because it was never perfect enough because the prompt wasn't perfect enough. And like the moral of the story is that like I would like it's kind of what we talked about yesterday is you want to work somewhere where you're passionate. Like I don't want to be somebody's YouTube video editor. So like I was more interested in getting output, seeing how I can manipulate ChatGPT to output the perfect prompt that I just like couldn't get it to write 600 words for me. I probably wrote like 20,000 words, but I just like, well, it's not 100%, so I'm just not going to do this. And I just decided not to go for that one. But through that, I learned that like, you know, ChatGPT is never going to get you all the way there. It's going to get you 80% of the way there, and you kind of have to like nudge it a little bit, or you know, see where you have to poke and do it yourself in some places. So like um, that, and also just like getting really obsessed with how to build perfect prompts was kind of like the point where you guys reached out to me, where I was like, okay, I can fulfill this quest.
That's cool.
Yeah,
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that like this sort of like over iteration is definitely a big pitfall of
yeah,
AI because it's cheaper than ever, less time than ever. And so, you probably iterated 15 times over something that in a normal context you would have maybe been able to do 2 or 3
yeah,
minutes. And I think there's power there, but it's a trap.
for
I
sure.
think we probably all fell in. Um, I think from my perspective, not to come across like with hubris or like lack of self-awareness, but I believe that a lot of the training that I received in design thinking, problem framing, problem seeking, facilitation has just like translated well to talking to AI. And the best example I have of this is Cisco, creators of WebEx, have an enterprise design thinking framework that is phenomenal. It is one of the best enterprise design approaches that can be distributed and sort of like given to other going with designers to solve these things. They're trying to allow people to solve, to fish for themselves, right?
Yeah.
And so one of my favorite things there, like at the very start of the framework, is just a clear way to structure a problem statement. And it's, as stupid simple as like, today, the current situation is this, a surprising insight as a result of that situation. Therefore, we need to do X. And so then you can take that framework and they have structured solution statements that they utilize. They have structured business case statements that you can utilize to really ground what's the big idea here. And I found using that flow and talking to Cursor, GPT, Perplexity, I mean, I'm producing designs faster than
Yeah,
anybody
sure.
I know that are structured using auto layout, following box model appropriately. I mean, it's not just like garbage. You know what I mean? Like we're actually producing structured output via these AI assistant tools.
Yeah.
But I think that, and not to toot our own horn, but I think we're able to get alignment on design without ever having hired a designer because those semantic frameworks help you communicate the core and like the substance of what you're working on. And that's really important to like just get to the point with AI because we've all probably overloaded the context window with, 5,000 characters of things that we think are relevant. And it's really hard, I think, to truly know like the meaning sometimes of what we're packing into the context. And so Cisco's like framework, like I haven't really changed how I speak about design to the AI, but I think I'm getting better output than my peers because I'm employing those things, if it makes sense.
No, yeah, I definitely think that makes sense. I think that a lot of people like instantly like expect that AI is going to like replace humans, and that narrative is so prevalent that like a lot of times they expect it to answer exactly as a human would, or use it exactly as they would use a human to help them with whatever task they're doing. And although I mean that's definitely like a goal for what they're trying to align, but yeah, I've definitely found that that's not the case. Like that oftentimes like you need to talk to it in a different way. You need to think about the problem more, and then a lot of times the issue that you're having is that you're not even thinking about the problem. And if you can combine the step of thinking about the problem, like when you first start on a primary task, almost everybody will open up like VS Code and write out a checklist of things they need to do.
Mhm.
Yeah, they started the solution.
Right? And like that is literally where the problem needs to start. And a lot of times people are just like, oh, I got this one random error, can figure it out. And a lot of times you'll end up in the same loop you would have ended up Googling on forums and figuring out if it's like who has had this problem? Oh, I had this problem. Oh, I corrected it. Like four thumbs down. This guy's done corrected. You know, like you have to deal with all of that stuff, right? And the AI can help you kind of parse through that information and do it faster. I think it kind of ties back to this pottery analogy where it's like you're able to iterate through these ideas like way faster as it goes out and does this web search that like is the output. And I think this is the biggest question that I struggle with is like if I'm able to iterate and create faster or like iterate through different possibilities faster, like is the beauty of like what is outputted in pottery by the fact that they only got 4 tries in the oven, or is it
Kill him. Yeah, kill him.
4 tries to make the is that what made it perfect, or is it that they, or is it like, or like because with AI you can iterate endlessly and endlessly. It's like where do you draw that line? I think everybody's kind of got their own bars of yours.
For sure, for sure. And I think a key part of it are the 10,000 pots that failed, for sure.
Yeah.
The value of expertise, rigor, iteration, and the fact that we, in this kind of accelerationist world we live in, enabled by AI, can do the requisite amount of iteration is a good thing, for sure. But like where I would just like kind of like connect that to though is that like someone's propensity to like overwork clay is an innate quality of themselves that they have to figure out what done means.
Mhm.
Do I keep this spinning and keep working it and risk overworking it and collapsing my solution?
Yeah.
Or do I stop here, put it in the kiln, wait for it to cure, reap that benefit? And it's so, we talk about what does done look like all the time.
Yeah.
Way more than in the past when you had your traditional sort of product development workflow where requirements get gathered, refined, prioritized, a design is made, that's then pitched over the wall to an engineer implements it.
If you're lucky, there was a definition of done section on the Jira ticket that someone maybe wrote to.
Yeah.
Acceptance criteria, like done was so much more important, I think, than it is today, because we do have this ability to like continually iterate and things are way less expensive. Cost of changes is like way low compared to your ability to influence the solution. Therefore, you should continue to try to influence better solutions. But then, really truly having there's no check the box the AI is done. Like, I don't think that's really there.
No, definitely. I think that we've also experienced that in building these AI experiences using the OpenAI API and all sorts of various different things. One of the huge issues that I've discovered compared to regular software, and this is true for all like cursor and AI tools, is that the definition of done is a artifice by design of the technology. Like the technology makes it hard to figure out what a done point is because oftentimes these things manifest as chat experiences, which is just an open text box that says, "What do you think?"
But I think like even before done, like kind of with the 10,000 failures you were talking about, there's like an interesting point to be made for like how we're using those failures in the context of the history of things we've tried, and like going back to the naive way that I was trying to write like 13 essays and kind of just throwing them away, like what the way that we're going now, the direction we're going is using that history of things we've tried to help it learn itself. And it knows nowadays, it knows chat history. Like it has kind of that built into its learning of those aren't really failures if we're gleaning something from that. So like there's like a difference between like trying something and then casting it out and just not using that as like data, and trying something and seeing what worked in little micro parts and what didn't, and then trying kind of using that to help it refine its next iteration. And that leads to less iterations. And then like back to the point where Eli made of like the design stuff is like another thing you can do is like provide it with some structures where like when he does his mock-ups, he has these responsive values built into to just the mock-up where it's kind of auto layout. And that translates really well when I'm collabing with him on bringing it into the code, because the AI will recognize those like responsive values and be able to transfer it directly into responsive code. So I see it as like a kind of helping you. Maybe you have a tool helping you, craft the pot.
Yeah, that kind of gets me thinking more towards like the next like question I had, which was, what do you guys think of like the role of the programmer in terms of like when we use these specifically when we use like UI automatic or AI UI creation?
Yeah, right.
So like like Eli uses a tool called Galileo that allows you to do UI through apps. I've seen him do some pretty magical things in this. In our team on the dev side, we use Cursor, which is like I think probably the leading AI IDE, which is an integrated development environment for devs to like work and build code.
Well, Copilot's definitely somewhere in there, right?
Copilot was like the first one,
And apparently, like Notepad++ is working on something behind the scenes.
Shout out to Matthias.
I was gonna say that a big thing too is that like these tools kind of like they change the way that process works, right? And I think I'm curious like how that workflow kind of ties together compared to the old workflow, and kind of what like how that is actually experienced. I'd love to get a little bit more details here. If you guys want to talk about Galileo and Cursor and kind of what makes it a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, like I think the role of front end UX engineering has so much opportunity as a result of both tools combined, and it in concert with Figma and Anima and some of the others that there used to be so many interpersonal problems when discussing design solutions. Somebody's worldview is different. Their opinion of how something should be communicated through visual language, copy. I mean, the amount of circuitous discussions on enterprise software for, maybe 100 users was so wasteful, frustrating. I've seen it burn people in agencies. And the fact that now I can leverage a workflow of tools where I can frame a problem using the right context and the right tools that we talked about, whether it's even in raw ChatGPT, Perplexity, or others. I can take that, expand it into UX flows, and describe required features and give it sort of atoms that I know are going to be requisite. That's what improves my Galileo like ability, I would say, is like a lot of people are using it at a very surface level to like give me an e-commerce cart. Well, there's so much more there, right? Like what are actually the sort of various atoms and components and templates that you expect to see, right? That ladder up to like an e-commerce page. By giving Galileo that, I mean, the designs are just so much more dialed in. And it's a shout out to Galileo for their technology being able to articulate it in box model, in auto layout that's compatible with Figma, Anima, and developer workflows. So then by taking that mock-up, I can go to Cursor. I can either drop in Figma via a plugin, or it does amazing on just raw PNG image. Add a couple of docs related to the frameworks we're using, the design systems we're employing, and tell it to apply web content accessibility guidelines because it knows it has enough context for that as well. And then I can either through documentation or through a design hand it off to Chris as a functional component that he can populate and hook up like via our APIs. That workflow alone on a single layout was a week of work, and it's happening in 30 minutes for us.
Yeah, for sure.
Like that's crazy, right? Like that is how I think it has changed. One designer can now facilitate AI assistance in a way that sometimes human assistance and design practices just fell apart. And there's people that are going to totally argue for forever probably that the old way is better because you're taking in human sort of like observation and experience. And
Yeah.
there's going to be all kinds of reasons why people will say, hey, don't use AI only workflow. And the only place that I really feel strongly about where I don't want it or to be involved is in reasoning based on like synthetic user representations. Like as long as we still ground everything we do in qualitative one-on-one ethnographic inquiry regardless. I'm just cutting out the opinionated designers portion of that ethnographic inquiry and grounding it totally in user need. And I think that's better. And so I think it's 100% improved. If anything, the efficiency has increased tenfold. And that's just one aspect of it in my mind. So it's just better at the end of the day.
Yeah.
How about you?
I mean, from the side of me using Cursor, I think like, first of all, it can also be used at a very atomic level where you can, one of the features that's been in there for a while that's probably still its most powerful feature is that every time it suggests code for you, you can apply it and it kind of applies it in like a get diff way where you can either accept that application or reject it and ask it something again. But also on the atomic level, you can accept individual lines of what you liked and then reject other ones that didn't quite work and then continue to refine it.
That's a great point
Yeah.
because I do find myself in Cursor thinking through those components where like if I don't like the pattern or the way that it has assembled those various atoms, I will selectively remove portions of it, give it a snippet from another component that matches the pattern that I expect, and let it fill in the lines.
Yeah.
And it's amazing to watch how then it can say, oh, okay, I see what I did good.
You're
I
kind
got
of,
to fill this
yeah,
gap in, matching the pattern. And it's so powerful in that regard.
because you can kind of help it back onto the path. And
Because Copilot feels, at least in my like experience, Copilot feels more like almost like a small shot completion algorithm where like if you give it a start, it'll continue. But
Yeah.
Copilot historically, in my experience, or prior to like adopting Cursor fully, like Copilot couldn't fill in those gaps as
Yeah.
well.
The closest thing to Copilot that I had used before, or to Cursor, sorry, before using that was this one called Aider. That's just a VS Code plugin that you kind of specify in comments what you want to do line by line, and then it runs down procedurally through the code and tries to do that step by step. And I thought, like, at the time, I was like, wow, this is cool. And I wrote out a little Rust project with it. But this is just so much more powerful in Cursor because you don't even need to be in the file. It's just in certain instances, you could go back to a git diff that was like working before a commit had been made and then change it based on your git history. So it's like extremely atomic where Copilot is not. It's kind of more like on the fly, has no context, which was the second thing I was going to talk about. The context is just like brings it to another level. And I see kind of context and this history of things you've asked it before as kind of like when you build a building, you'll see the workers working on with all sorts of scaffolding so that they don't fall off. And that's for those levels of scaffolding or levels of safety. And it kind of like with this git diff approach, you can always go back, revert to something. So if you had someone who is like totally new to Cursor, I think one of our strengths in the office is that we all kind of have a background in really having learned code and we can verify really quickly and see what it's doing, which is still kind of important because it's almost like if you don't know code before you use Cursor, you're kind of like having 16 beers and trying to drive. And like we're kind of using it in moderation where like we know what it's doing, but it just allows us to go so fast. And I think my kind of analogy with the safety is that if something ends up not working, I'm confident that I can revert it back, going back in the history and then just trying a new path, a new branch of the tree.
Right. And then that, like in the diff example, like Cursor specifically for people who haven't used it, simply using an app mention pattern, right? I can add specific documentation that crawled by their bot and indexed and brought into the context directly related to the context of the code base that is also being effectively chunked while I'm working. And so, like, to that point, like, not only can you add documentation, you can add your prior diffs
Yeah.
and your prior commits and say, this commit failed because of this commit failed because of that. I'm interested in progressing here. Use the git diff, use the documentation, use my existing code and specific snippets, all in a single IDE. Super intuitive patterns for, the default hotkeys are amazing. And so, like, what I'm finding even is things like being able to say, hey, like, I know iOS human interface guidelines, that's 300 pages of documentation, probably has had multiple millions, if not tens of millions of dollars in research applied to it to align that system. Why would I ever invent my own?
Yeah.
Right? I can pull that in now, and even working at Chakra or Vue anywhere, I can just give it the context of iOS guidelines, and that's what helps produce the responsive properties with, proper padding, proper margin, line spacing, responsive fonts, because it's just referencing best practices from the 800-pound gorillas. And that's we should all be pirating off of their research, right? Like 100%.
Which, by the way, I don't think I've even sipped a beer for 4 years. So, like, don't drink anything and drive people. That's a bad
No
example.
drinking.
Also, there's excessive amount of beer.
I was trying, yeah.
Cursors
Some people do though.
and things that you have to deal with and interpersonally, technically, etc. Like come up, and there's always that messy middle. The AI had the promise, like a lot of people think AI has the promise of removing the messy middle. What I would argue that we found is that it actually has the experience of just getting to the messy middle faster. And a lot of times teams just don't want to deal with what that means. Like it means that like a person might not be stalled for 3 days figuring out if the component is going to load into the environment correctly. But once they figure that out, you were going to have a conversation with them anyway, things you'd forgotten the requirements. There's a constant conversation there. You kind of get there faster. And it just, to me, it doesn't replace the humans building software because the assumption that it replaces programmers is like what I would consider like a junior level developer assumption of like that the amount of time you spend typing on your keyboard directly correlates to output.
Mm-hmm.
Like it doesn't. Like it
No.
ultimately comes down to like the types of issues that you have to face head on. That if your team isn't trying to or isn't doing that, you would have had that problem for a long period of time.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, if anything, I think it exacerbates the problems of the messy middle by
Yeah.
applying what really is fundamentally like accelerationist philosophy. Like we all adopt it, right?
For sure.
It's speed iteration, rigor, loops, like get into the work. And I think that the problems that we're seeing exacerbated by it are actually ones that I'm so much more interested to work on with you all that are related to communication, alignment, distributing control amongst our team to avoid any kind of like gatekeeping, allowing everybody to contribute equally. Like all of those are such powerful things to focus on that AI will allow for. We've seen how if we accelerate too quickly into a solution and don't bring others up to speed, the potential problems and pitfalls of that. And so by like accelerating the time to the messy middle and then allowing for so much more mess in the middle, I think that's the bulk of what we're going to be focusing on in the latter half of the year, at least internally, amongst the way we work. Because whether it's process, whether it's simply communicating in public forums about ideas and getting buy-in, like so much of like the process of making is honestly about influence and alignment and kind of a shared understanding. And I think it's getting harder with AI, but
It's getting harder. Yeah.
It's not overcomable, or it's
I think it can be
unable to be overcome, right?
That's something we're working on currently in the office, is trying to overcome kind of like making Cursor better, like at responding with best practices that have been established in the office, and things like the Cursor has a Cursor rules file that can prompt it on how to reply in the best way, and you can kind of shape its replies to customize it.
The dot cursor rules file.
But I'm confident we can make it able to answer in a way that devs who don't even use it like, and like make them like it, because all of its answers are using best practices in our eyes.
Yeah, so I think it benefits from like the prevalence of documentation or like even the maintenance of it. Like AI can generate that, but it still has to be maintained or AI can maintain it.
Yeah.
But like the idea of that documentation is a step that like most technology projects when they start, there's just developers running and they have all that information in their head, so it's in the code technically, right? And like a lot of times you can't really derive that context from code because it came from like a meeting where Mike was talking to Sally, who is like the product head, and she said to do this, and then he said to do that, but found out he couldn't do it because of this technical requirement. And so like, what are we going to do? Like, so then you have to do this, and like all of those changes are like known by the members of the team, but not documented. So like AI is like not a superhero. It can't come in and figure out all this stuff.
And it makes it worse because in that example, Sally is the AI, right? And so in our current environment, we've all had isolated discussions with the AI, solving problems in discrete environments, although within the broader context of our solution. But then when we come back together and we've got 3 competing solutions much more frequently than we used to,
Yeah.
it comes back to how do we make decisions? How do we know what goals are or what done looks like? And then how do we sort of prioritize and pick, how to go?
That's
the hard work.
One of the undiscovered or underrated strengths of Cursor is that they've opened up the ability to build on top of it. And I think the stronger we make it, the more we can go extremely fast and also clean up any sort of mess it leaves along the way. So it's only going to get better from there.
I think so too.
Totally. Yeah. I think that like it really reminds me, I think that my overall assessment of using it in the dev experience reminds me of a pretty like if you guys are gonna quote architects, I'm going deep on software engineering. I forgot the name of the author, but he's wildly famous for a book called The Mythical Man Month from like the 80s, I would say. Yeah.
Good old MMM.
It's Fred Brooks, I think is his name. He wrote a book called Mythical Man Month, and I was talking about that because he has an essay called No Silver Bullet. And the premise of the essay is that there is no single technology that could promise a order of magnitude improvement of productivity from the current standard within a decade ever. That was like his assessment.
Yeah.
And I think there was like a wide understanding in the industry that like when I came out, he was wrong. He was incorrect. And I think that more or less as we've done this, I found that we are able to move faster in so many ways and do things in like such a unique way that makes us all feel more creative and it brings out the best of all of us. But there is no silver bullet for delivering an app just because someone said one sentence and wants it. Like it doesn't really do that. Like it allows us to move faster, but it puts these problems that are at the forefront of software, the heavy problems that, it's great when you get a day you don't have to deal with those as a developer. Right. Like those problems just come to the forefront faster. And I don't think they're solved by just like being able to organize this, organize that better. But they can put you in a position where you have time to actually solve them.
Because we're asking the questions we want to ask instead of like the tedious kind of
exactly.
questions we have to deal with every day.
Disorganized in terms of if one developer writes a piece of code and another developer writes a piece of code using a different library and it does the same thing, you want your team to decide on what library.
Yeah. For sure.
Right. So like if your team was already cool with like doing that kind of thing, they're going to use AI to make code that is just scattered and complex.
That's what I'm saying though, is in the Cursor rules file, you can define the libraries that we're going to use and standardize it.
Yeah. Like these AI provides tools to like augment like these processes of developers so that we can spend our time thinking about the implications of the system we're building and the responsibilities we have to maintain that system. Right. I think we're able to get there faster, but it's not the silver bullet that everybody promises. And I think that the biggest example of when I realized the silver bullet was real was when we started delivering AI products. And like before November 2022, when ChatGPT was released, computers could not talk. That was like an understatement. Is that they can't just produce text and respond to you. Like the Turing test was a thing. Nothing had passed that in an earnest way, let alone a technology that we could all access and roll out. Right? Like when that happened, it shocked me how quickly people went from, wow, this is magical, to, hey, now you guys built this for me. It's not saying what I want it to say. Right to where we were. Everybody's expectations have just leveled up times 10.
Yeah.
We're still expected to meet them. And I think that more than anything, that's the existential threat that I think a lot of developers feel is just how fast people were like, yeah, this thing doesn't talk right.
Right.
Previously just building buttons on a
Yeah.
website, right? Now it's like there's a much more complex way to approach these things. I think it just shows that like the industry is going to keep on moving.
No, and
It's not, we're not done. We're not all losing our jobs yet. There's going to be something else for us to configure, although it might look a little different.
no, and I just, have to say, like, I am so excited about approaching these things with you all and our engineers across the US, globally. It's exactly the problem set that I want to be addressing rather than just continuing, some of the rote, like,
Yeah.
exhaustion that I was facing prior to that time. And so I'm just candidly excited for what the next 3 months hold in the short term. Plus, when we come up for air around holiday season and reflect on what this year has sort of made and the ways that we've grown, like it's going to be almost unrecognizable even 6 months from now. And the same way that 6 months prior to this, Cursor wasn't really as hot as it was, right? And now here we are with like this burgeoning sort of forefront of the IDE kind of like AI assisted development. I think being early adopters of that has put us in a really interesting position to keep sharing and spreading like good news about it. I don't think we need to proselytize, but do think there is a lot of fear and emotions in the industry and the engineering talent that we associate ourselves with. We have to be both like accommodating, educational, open, and adaptive about how people leverage these things. I mean, we all are using them so differently.
I think it's a double-edged sword, just like any new technology or any technology at all. Like, I mean, you can tell a story where like social networks save the world, or you can tell a story where they're going to kill us all. I think it's all about the people that you're implementing that technology with. And like you said, I'm glad to be doing it with you guys, but there are people across the world that are taking an approach of like, we can make this good for all programmers. We can augment what they're doing. And we can allow programmers to focus on the stuff that brings them joy in the project. It was very rarely, although sometimes, a well-written.
Right, a good SQL yeah, a SQL query.
Ultimately, I think that the joy you get is collaborating with other people, and it's going to go away. It's going to be what people are chasing, and I think it's like having them feel that is something that will never be replaced. And so I think that's where I think it's short-sighted to say that programmers are being replaced, but I don't think that it's short-sighted to fear that. Is what I would say.
No, I think it's good to be aware of those emotions. Yeah, thanks so much for facilitating, Keith.
It's a great conversation. See more of these in the future.
Prefer.
Hey. Oi. Hey.